Dr. Thomas, just a reminder, you're still under oath.
Thank you.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Thomas, I want to briefly go back to Exhibit 918 that we discussed, and then we're going to resume our discussion on homicide after that. Just to clarify for the jurors what these various classifications are. If we talk about natural, you discussed that with us. As
Yes.
An example of a natural manner of death would be, for example, a heart attack.
Yes.
If we talk about an accidental cause of death, where would drug overdose fit in general as a cause of death?
Usually drug overdoses are accidental unless there's evidence of intent, in which case it would be suicidal.
So we know what suicide is.
Yes.
And undetermined. If the medical examiner can't tell which of these it is or what it is, then undetermined is what you would indicate.
Exactly.
So if the manner of death here has been determined to be homicide, does that, in your opinion as a medical examiner, rule out a death by accidental drug overdose?
Yes.
Now, Brett, let's go back to Exhibit 952. That's admitted for demonstrative purposes. So, Doctor, we were talking about the designation of homicide.
Yes.
And tell us what this guide is as relates to how we define homicide as medical examiners.
Homicide is defined in its most broad sense as death at the hands of another. And it goes into more detail if we wanted to look at that.
Yes. So if, but this is guidance given from the National Association of Medical Examiners to medical examiners.
Exactly.
And it provides guidance and guidelines on how to designate a manner of death as homicide.
Yes.
So Brett, if we could go to the next slide. So Doctor, could you read this in for the record?
Homicide occurs when death results from a volitional act committed by another person to cause fear, harm, or death. Intent to cause death is a common element, but is not required for classification as homicide more below. It is to be emphasized that the classification of homicide for the purposes of death certification is a neutral term and neither indicates nor implies criminal intent, which remains a determination within the province of legal processes.
And you agree with this?
Absolutely.
It's a guideline you follow?
Yes.
And have you followed this kind of a guideline for the years you've been a medical examiner?
Yes.
Is there more guidance given from the National Association of Medical Examiner guidelines on what constitutes voluntary acts?
Yes.
If you could click one more, Brett. And so, Dr. Thomas, could you read this for us?
In general, if a person's death results at the hands of another who committed a harmful volitional act directed at the victim, the death may be considered a homicide from the death investigation standpoint. And then, although there may not have been intent to kill the victim died because of the harmful intentional volitional act committed by another person. Thus, the manner of death may be classified as homicide because of the intentional or volitional act, not because there was an intent to kill.
And when you agree with the conclusion that Dr. Baker reached of homicide, is this the definition of homicide that you're applying that we saw in these two slides?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Now I want to ask you about a new subject, and this has to do with certain studies that assess whether the prone restraint is dangerous from a breathing point of view. And I'd like to get your perspective as a forensic pathologist and a medical examiner in this respect. Are you aware of any such studies?
Yes.
Do you agree generally with the research that comes to a conclusion that the prone restraint is not dangerous for respiration?
In certain laboratory safe settings, that may be true, but I do not agree with their applicability to real life situations.
If you could generally characterize for the jurors, what's the punchline of these studies? What do they show?
Well, they purport to show that putting someone in a prone position, even with some restraint and with weight on their back, is perfectly safe.
And do you find the studies to be reliable, or do you find them controversial?
Well, I think they are fine for laboratory purposes, but they bear no resemblance to real-world situations. So I would say they're irrelevant for purposes of what we're talking about here.
And so how do they then not relate to the real world? What's artificial about them?
Well, I would say for starters, these are volunteers who have agreed to be put in this dangerous position of a prone restraint. But they know perfectly well at any point, if they feel scared or uncomfortable, all they have to do is say, stop. And that has happened in some of these studies, that a couple of the volunteers have said, wait, no, I can't tolerate being in this position. It's too scary. So that, to me, immediately takes out that whole element that we were talking about the terror, the physiologic stress. So that's number one. Number two is they're healthy volunteers. These are young people who have, mostly young people, mostly healthy, who have agreed to be part of this study. So it doesn't relate to someone who may have other underlying factors that may contribute. Thirdly, they're put on a like a gymnastics mat to be face down. So it's completely different when you're squished between a person and a hard ground versus having a evenly distributed weight on your back and you're on a mat. Fourth, I guess, and perhaps most significantly here, none of them went on and on and on beyond the point where the person stopped breathing and where their heart stopped. So they were being monitored the whole time, and if at any point they had significant respiratory or cardiac difficulties, the study would have stopped, and the person volunteering knew that. So to me, it bears no resemblance to what Mr. Floyd experienced.
Did any of the studies involve a knee on the neck of any of the volunteers?
No,
Any of them go on for as long as 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
no.
Do you know if any of the studies actually measured the decrease in lung volumes as part of the study, that is, decrease in oxygen reserves?
Not that I know of, no.
So any relevance to George Floyd at all?
Not in my opinion, no.
So, Dr. Thomas, have you done any calculations or kind of work of your own to measure what the subdual and the restraint with the knee on the neck and the back of George Floyd would have done to his oxygen reserves or lung capacities?
No, that would be something I would completely defer to a pulmonary doctor to address.
So then are you able to tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if you haven't done that work, whether the forces that Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have even killed a normal, healthy person?
In the way you phrased that, not based on lung volume and that kind of study. I mean, from watching the video, I certainly wouldn't want to be in that position, but that's a different answer.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
Mr. Nelson.
You don't want. Morning, Dr. Thomas.
Morning.
How are you today?
Good, thank
Good.
you.
Nice to see you. You described being a forensic pathologist as sort of being the doctor's doctor, right?
General pathologist is considered that, yes.
Right. And the forensic pathologist, in terms of a death investigation, you kind of have to wear many hats, right?
Yes,
You have to have a broad familiarity with multiple medical conditions, right?
yes,
And sometimes medical conditions may appear at autopsy that you've never seen before,
yes,
right? Some strange disease that you've never seen, right?
yes,
And you will speak to other doctors, right?
yes,
You will gather information and they'll share information with you to help you make conclusions in an autopsy, right?
yes,
And you also described how being a medical examiner is more than just the autopsy, right?
yes,
The autopsy is one small part of a death investigation, right?
yes,
You described reviewing videotapes in certain circumstances, right?
yes,
Past medical records, right?
yes,
Interviews with friends, family members, people who knew the decedent, right?
yes,
And ultimately, the medical examiner's office compiles a massive, amount of information itself about the cause and manner of death, right?
yes,
And you've had an opportunity to review a lot of that information in this case, correct?
yes.
Now, have you reviewed all of the interviews of witnesses?
Probably not all of them, no.
Okay. Have you, after you prepared your report, have you been provided with additional materials that may be relevant to your considerations?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. And we'll come back to that. So I just kind of want to, but you did have an opportunity to review Dr. Baker's entire file, right?
Yes,
And I believe we'll be hearing from Dr. Baker later this morning or this afternoon, but we'll have some questions for him. I would like to follow up on some of your conclusions. There's a term used in Dr. Baker's autopsy, the cause of death, the term complicating.
yes.
Can you define, medically speaking, what the term complicating means?
Oh, I guess it could be used in lots of different ways. The way I would think of it in this setting is both things were present, that there was a cardiopulmonary arrest and that it was due to law enforcement, subdual restraint, and compression. I guess that's how I would consider it in this setting.
Have you been provided with any information about Dr. Baker's opinions in this case?
Nothing very specific. I mean, just what he put in the autopsy report and all of his conclusions.
So in terms of the word complicating, it's capable of different definitions based upon the forensic pathologist, right?
Yes,
Right. And so you, as a forensic pathologist, may have a different interpretation of what complicating means compared to Dr. Baker, for example.
yes,
And there's a reasonable degree of disagreement amongst, in any case generally, it's reasonable for doctors to disagree with each other, is it not?
that sometimes happens, yes.
All right. You did not perform the actual autopsy of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct,
And that was Dr. Baker who did that, right?
yes,
And you know Dr. Baker well,
yes,
and you know him to be a competent medical examiner?
yes,
He's the chief medical examiner for Hennepin County at this time.
Yes.
Now, you were provided again with all of the information from his report, and I would like to go through a few of the things with you. Let's talk about Mr. Floyd's heart first.
Okay.
What was the size of Mr. Floyd's heart as measured at autopsy?
The weight of Mr. Floyd's heart was 540 grams.
And would you explain, or would you describe that as an enlarged heart?
I would say it's a slightly enlarged heart, yes.
And there are some different measures of how to base an enlarged heart, or how to determine if a heart is enlarged, right?
Right. By some categories, that heart would not be considered enlarged.
So there's two, as I understand it, two different kind of primary measurements, or primary ways of comparing Mr. Floyd's heart to determine if it's enlarged, right? The Molina studies and the Northwestern studies.
Oh, I see. There's probably multiple ways of looking at heart weights. I mean, those are two of them. There's the study from the Mayo Clinic. There's one in Europe. There's lots of ways of analyzing.
But ultimately, based on all of your information, you would agree that Mr. Floyd's heart was slightly enlarged, right?
Yes.
In terms of the DeMaio and Molina standard, what would a normal male heart weigh for a person similar to Mr. Floyd?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Would you disagree if I said it was 383 grams?
That well could be. For the average, I mean.
For the average, right.
Yeah.
So according to, if that were the average heart rate, or heart size, heart weight, 383 grams, relevant to Mr. Floyd's heart would be considered profoundly enlarged.
Well, the thing about using averages in, especially medicine, which is of course what I'm most familiar with, is we don't generally just compare it to an average. We usually compare it to an average plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So that's why the range that I usually use is, from 253 to 510 grams would be the range of normal for someone of Mr. Floyd's height. And so I don't know in the DeMaio Molina study what their 2 standard deviations would be.
Okay.
But I wouldn't use just the average.
Okay, and so in terms of how you would assess the weight or size of the heart, you would say 510 grams is the high, 510 grams is the high end?
Right.
Of that, and 540 exceeds that, right?
Right.
And so in terms of whether it's a very enlarged heart or even a relatively minimally enlarged heart, a larger heart requires more blood, right?
Yes, it has greater demand, yes.
What are some of the things that cause a person to have an enlarged heart?
Probably the primary cause is high blood pressure.
And you understand, based on Mr. Floyd's medical records, that he did in fact have a history of high blood pressure, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe the blood vessels of the heart?
There are several major coronary arteries that's, as I mentioned, supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle. There's the left and right, and then the left branches into the left anterior descending and the left circumflex, and then there's some other branches off that.
And how would you describe narrowing or stenosis of the coronary arteries?
So the way we as forensic pathologists describe it is we look at the opening. So if an opening is fully open, then that would be 0% narrowing. And if it's completely closed, then that would be 100% occluded. And so then we look at anything ranging from, 25, 50, 75, 90%. Obviously, it's just an eyeball estimation. We don't actually get out calipers and measure, because the actual percentage doesn't really matter. It's more, did they have coronary artery disease? Was it pretty good, pretty bad? That sort of thing.
Can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing?
The way the coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, they come off of the aorta, which is the main vessel that takes blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And so in close to the aorta is called proximal to the aorta, and then the further out it goes, distributing blood along the way to the heart muscle, is called distal.
And when you have proximal narrowing, how does that affect the heart?
It can narrow the blood supply to more of the heart than if you have distal narrowing.
Another way of saying that would be it decreases the amount of blood the heart is getting, right?
Yes.
And it also affects how things are removed from the heart, right? Like CO2, carbon dioxide.
Well, that's different. That wouldn't happen from the blood vessels coming in, I don't think. So I wouldn't include carbon dioxide in that.
Is there a standard within forensic pathology where pathologists would consider to be that there's enough of a narrowing to cause sudden death?
So the way I would describe that is anything over more than 70 to 75% is, in the view of a forensic pathologist, something that, in the absence of another cause of death, could be used to explain death. Now, it's also true that people live with 100% occlusion and go on and do fine. So you have to understand, this is strictly my perspective as a forensic pathologist, and everyone I see is dead. So that's kind of a different perspective.
Can you explain what myocyte necrosis is?
The myocyte is the name of the heart muscle cell. So cyte means cell, it's C-Y-T-E, and myo means muscle. So when you have a heart myocyte, it's the heart muscle cell, and necrosis means death. So if you see myocyte necrosis, that means there are dead heart muscle cells.
And do you have to have myocyte necrosis to cause sudden death?
No, you don't have to have myocyte necrosis.
And would you say that hypoxia is the absence of oxygen, agreed?
Yes.
And can hypoxia of the heart cause sudden death by other means?
Hypoxia means low oxygen, sorry. And your question is, can low oxygen to the heart cause sudden death through an arrhythmia, I presume, yes.
Okay. What would you, how would you describe the conduction system of the heart?
The way the heart beats, the lub-dub, is that there are electrical currents that go through the heart muscle. And normally there's a certain sequence in which the heart muscles will fire. And that's called the conduction system, through which the electrical impulses flow. And that's what keeps the heart beating in a regular rhythm, that beat, beat, beat. And yeah, that's the conduction system.
So what happens if the conduction system is impaired?
Then you can get what's called an arrhythmia, or abnormal beating of the heart.
And that can result in sudden death?
It can, yes.
Which artery supplies that kind of like that pacemaker of the heart?
Oh, it probably is variable from person to person. I mean, I think the coronary artery that we consider the most important usually is the left anterior descending coronary artery, but there's a lot of individual variability.
Can you, what about the right coronary artery?
It really depends on any given person, which part of the heart is supplied by their particular distribution.
Okay. And in Mr. Floyd's autopsy, the right coronary artery, Dr. Baker determined had a 90% occlusion, correct?
90% narrowing, yes.
When someone is exerting themselves, does that make the heart work harder?
Yes.
Does that mean that more blood, oxygen, it needs more blood to function? The heart needs more blood to function at that time?
Yes.
It's kind of like when we think about exerting anything like jogging, running, the heart needs more blood and hence more oxygen in order to function properly, right?
Yes.
You also described the fight or flight kind of the physiology of that in your consideration, right?
Yes, the physiological stress. Mhm.
And the physiological stress produces adrenaline, right?
Yes.
And that also causes the heart to work harder
Yes.
and therefore need more blood
Yes.
and more oxygen.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. In this particular case, right, we have a heart that is at least above average, right, needing more blood. We have a heart with a occluded right coronary artery, right, narrowed.
Mhm.
We have a heart that the left anterior descending artery also had a 75% narrowing, right?
Yes.
And so you have, and then you have an exertion of stress producing adrenaline, right?
Yes.
So the heart has to work very, very hard in this case. Fair to
Yes.
say? Let's take the police out of this, and I'm going to ask you a hypothetical. Let's assume you found Mr. Floyd dead in his residence, no police involvement, no drugs, right? The only thing you found would be these facts about his heart. What would you conclude to be the cause of death?
In that very narrow set of circumstances, I would probably conclude that the cause of death was his heart disease.
So have you, as a forensic pathologist, ever certified a death due to arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease?
Probably thousands of times, yes.
With similar degrees of narrowing of the arteries?
Yes.
Have you ever certified a death due to hypertensive cardiomegaly? I'm trying to...
Yes, hypertensive cardiovascular disease, yes, absolutely.
With a heart at this weight or even smaller?
Well, if it was, again, in this setting where that was the only abnormal finding, then I would probably go with that, yes.
So one of the things that has to be considered in this particular case is Mr. Floyd's heart, right?
Yes.
And even without any sort of an exertion, again, take the exertion out of it, take the police out of it, take the drugs out of it, that's a potential cause of death that needs to be considered.
Yes.
You discussed the abrasions that you saw and the jury saw pictures of. You would agree that the abrasions are in a left to right pattern?
Meaning there are more on the left than on the right?
Right.
On his face, yes. On his shoulder, yes. And then he had the abrasions on his right hand.
And even in terms of the pattern of the abrasion, there's up and down abrasion. An abrasion could go from the bottom of my body up, or it could go from left to right, right?
Yes. I guess I didn't really focus on what direction the abrasions were going in that sense.
Okay, and that's fine. But you would agree that one possible way that at least some of these abrasions occurred would be when Mr. Floyd was initially put down on the ground.
I guess they could, yes.
Right. And not all of those abrasions necessarily occurred while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, right?
That's hard to answer,
Right.
I would say.
It's hard to answer when the abrasions were there and
Right.
what caused the abrasions, right?
Right.
And if someone was being held down with the weight of 3 people, would you expect those to be more punctile in their nature or abrade, like with the lines and movements?
Oh, gosh, there are too many variables there, I would say.
Okay. Now, you ultimately determined that this case was an asphyxiation, essentially, right?
Yes, that was the primary mechanism.
Right. And asphyxiation is simply the lack of oxygen to the brain,
Yeah, low oxygen, inadequate oxygen.
inadequate oxygen to the brain specifically.
Yes.
And in terms of asphyxiation, you would agree that there are multiple things that can cause asphyxiation.
Yes.
So you use the reference to someone being strangled, right?
Yes.
So if I came up to you and I strangled, or I strangled a person, put my hands around their neck, there are certain things that you would expect to see, right?
Sometimes you do, yes. And that's great when you do. You don't always, but
And those would be things like a broken hyoid bone,
yeah,
right? The petechial hemorrhaging that you discussed.
yes.
And in an asphyxia death, there are frequently, those types of signs available, right?
Well, it really depends on the mechanism of asphyxia.
Okay, so let's go back to the mechanisms of asphyxia. You described strangling would be one.
Yeah,
Hanging could be one,
yes.
right? You've described positional or mechanical asphyxia.
Those are types, yes.
Yep. Positional being, based on the position of the body. Mechanical being something, using some sort of a device to asphyxiate someone.
Oh, well, we haven't really talked a lot about positional and mechanical. I mean, there's all kinds of things under both of those that can cause low oxygen.
And one of the things that can cause a low oxygen to the brain is the use of controlled substances, correct?
Well, eventually, yes. Yes.
So someone can ingest a particular type of a controlled substance. That particular substance could affect the diaphragm, right?
It affects some controlled substances affect the ability to breathe, which then decreases the oxygen, which then leads to low oxygen, yes.
Right. And that's essentially what you're saying is that there, in this particular case, as I understand it with my notes, is that essentially what happens is there was some event that happened that resulted in a decrease of oxygen to the brain, and that resulted in death.
Yes.
And that's essentially what asphyxia is generally.
Inadequate oxygen, yes.
Right. Okay. And you were asked a series of questions about some studies in terms of, I think they're called they're out of San Diego or
Yes, Dr. Chan. And
Dr.
his group.
Chan's,
Mhm.
right? Yep. Are you familiar with the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine?
Yes.
Now, you testified that some of the problems with the Chan studies were that they were in laboratory settings. Sorry, laboratory settings. That they were controlled environments, healthy individuals, etc. Right?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. Christine Hall and her paper, Incidence and Outcome of Prone Positioning Following Police Use of Force in a Prospective Consecutive Cohort of Subjects?
Is that the one from Canada?
Yes.
Yes.
And that was essentially an analysis of actual police encounters, correct?
Yes. In
And-
Canada.
In Canada, understood. but they actually, that study, they go through and they look at the number of police-citizen interactions, correct?
Yes.
And then from those police-citizen interactions, they further go in to look at how many involved being placed in the prone position or a non-prone position, correct?
Yes.
They consider various actual real-life variables, agreed?
Yeah.
And including drugs, whether drugs were on board, whether the length of time to a certain extent that someone was in the prone position, agreed?
Yes.
And ultimately, they analyzed about 3,000 prone positional placements
Yes.
out of a total of like 1.1 million police interactions.
Yes.
So 1.1 million police interactions resulting in about 3,000 prone position arrests. That those these are real people, real incidents, right?
Yeah.
And in those 3,000 or so interactions, there were no deaths that occurred.
Isn't that amazing? When you consider that virtually every forensic pathologist in the United States has probably had an officer-involved death like this. How did they, it utterly baffles me, which is why I kept saying Canada, because I think, I don't know what's different, but
I'm going to object
that-
at this time as
sorry.
non-responsive.
Yeah, the answer would be
So the let me ask you, in terms of hypoxia, can you again define hypoxia?
low oxygen.
Right. And which organ is more sensitive to the lack of oxygen? The brain? The brain.
Absolutely.
The brain's the most, it needs the most oxygen, right?
Yes.
And that's because it's doing millions of things simultaneously, right? Agreed?
Yes, I'm sure there's lots of reasons metabolically why it needs oxygen.
Right. I think a previous witness testified that it takes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply to function, right?
That sounds about right, yes.
But the heart also needs oxygen, right?
Yes.
So in terms of the professional standards for determining an asphyxia death, is it true that you have to first exclude all natural and non-natural cases or causes of death?
Well, you can have natural and non-natural causes of low oxygen. So I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand.
Sure. There's a criteria that's established for making a determination of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, right?
Well, I'm not really sure what, I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Fair enough. Is the prone position in and of itself inherently dangerous?
Not if there are no other factors.
Okay. So the prone position is examined and used in a lot of different settings, right?
Correct.
I mean, even in hospitals, in the treatment of, say, COVID, the prone position is used.
Correct.
And in those circumstances, being in a prone position is not inherently dangerous, right?
Yes.
I mean, chiropractors put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
Massage therapists put people in the prone position, right?
Yes.
So the prone position, I'm just talking generally
Right,
speaking, no
right.
other factors. The prone position in and of itself is not inherently dangerous, right?
Right.
Is the prone position on concrete inherently dangerous?
Again, with no other factors, as long as someone can breathe, no.
Right. I could be laying by the pool in Florida, right?
Right.
On my stomach in the prone position, not inherently dangerous.
Right.
Do you know, or did you take into consideration Mr. Chauvin's weight in your analysis?
Oh, I'm aware of his weight. I would say I took it into some consideration, but it wasn't a major factor one way or the other.
Okay. You reviewed all of the videos, right?
Yes.
And it's fair to say that portions of his weight were placed on Mr. Floyd's body at a different distribution.
Yes.
And ultimately, in terms of the autopsy that Dr. Baker conducted, in terms of the area in the shoulders, the back, and the neck, no bruising was found, right?
Right.
In your experience as a forensic pathologist, if someone is placing a significant amount of weight on a person's area for a prolonged period of time, would you expect to see bruising?
You might or might not. It's so variable.
And you would agree that there are no abrasions or bruising described in the autopsy in the neck area of Mr. Floyd?
Correct.
There's no bleeding into the muscles in his back, right?
Correct.
You would agree that the knee is sort of a pointy or a more protuberant part of the body?
I guess so. It's kind of flat on top because of the patella, but
Right. And when we talk about the shin bone itself, there's not a lot in between the skin and the shin bone, right?
that is true. Yes.
And it's sort of a triangular shape, right?
Yes.
And again, along Mr. Floyd's back, there's no long bruise consistent with a shin bone, right?
Right.
And there's no more circular bruise consistent with a kneecap.
Right.
You've reviewed, obviously, a lot of strangulation type cases in those, in your career?
Yes.
Strangulation with the hands, right?
Primarily manual, but also ligature.
Ligature being like a rope or a phone cord or something.
Exactly.
And in those manual strangulation cases, the pressure that's exerted in that will frequently leave bruises, fingerprint-sized bruises, right?
Frequently, but not always.
And ultimately, what increases the likelihood of seeing a bruise is the amount of force that's applied, right?
You know, I don't know what all the factors are, whether it's fragility of the vessels, whether it's the length of time, whether it's the force, whether it's the location. I think there are lots of variables.
So, yes.
And everyone bruises differently.
So yesterday depends on what medications they may take, right? So yesterday there was an analysis or an analogy to sitting on a church bench and you don't bruise your behind.
And that can feel long.
Would it be different if you're sitting on a church bench with a baseball, for example, underneath your butt?
I really couldn't say.
All right. So in terms of Dr. Baker's autopsy, you would agree that there's really no objective evidence showing any pressure to the back of Mr. Floyd.
There is nothing at the autopsy. That's correct.
Did you find, or did Dr. Baker find hypoxic changes in his brain?
He died too quickly for that to show up.
And that's when we talk about the lack of ischemic hypoxia, correct? Dr. Baker noted a lack of ischemic hypoxia.
I don't remember his exact words. You're describing lack of ischemic changes in the neurons?
Correct.
Yes.
In the brain.
Yes, because that has to happen over a period of time.
Okay. And when someone is experiencing that shortness of oxygen or that lack of oxygen to the brain, that will frequently lead to certain symptoms, right?
Yes,
Confusion is one.
that could be, yes.
Restlessness,
Could be, yes.
shortness of breath,
Could be,
visual changes,
could be,
incoherent speaking.
could be.
So, to your knowledge, did Mr. Floyd, in the videos that you observed, ever complain of these any visual changes?
No.
Did he appear to be confused to you?
So what time period are we talking about? Sorry.
Sure, that helps, maybe if we narrow down that time. The 9 minutes, during the 9 minutes that Mr. Floyd was restrained, did he appear confused to you?
Oh, gosh. How do you describe his behavior?
Well, I mean, did he was articulating that he was in pain, right?
Yes, and then he couldn't breathe and he calls for his mother and he says he loves people. I mean, you might interpret that as confusion or you might interpret it a different way.
Did he appear to be breathing during this time frame?
Not effectively,
Do you know how many breaths per minute?
no.
If one expert indicated it was at a rate of 22 breaths per minute, would you disagree?
I would have no way of assessing that.
When someone is hypoxic, they start breathing faster, right?
That can be a mechanism of trying to balance.
At least for the first 5 minutes or so, Mr. Floyd was talking, right?
Well, again,
In talking, yes or no? He was talking.
he was, yes, there were words, yes.
So he had an open airway.
Yes,
And you'd agree that, or would you agree that at some point he went limp,
yes.
right? And would you describe what you saw as the progression of hypoxia in that instance at the point he goes limp?
That is certainly a good explanation for it, yes.
Was not a sudden hypoxic event, right?
That is my interpretation, yes.
You would agree that if he was progressively growing hypoxic, you would expect whole body hypoxia? I'll rephrase my question.
Yeah,
'cause
sorry.
I'm not a doctor, so I have to rely on my notes quite a bit. So if he was progressively suffering from whole body hypoxia, the brain would be the first thing that would show signs of hypoxia.
Oh, I see, yes, yes, the brain is the most sensitive.
And you would agree that that would not occur in a matter of seconds, but it would take a matter of minutes, right?
Correct.
And asphyxia due to position or compression, that prevents air from getting into the lungs, right?
Yes,
And that leads to what we would call a global hypoxia.
we haven't really used that word global.
Whole body,
I mean, if there's inadequate oxygen, the blood flows everywhere, so I guess that's what you're talking about.
But the brain is the first thing to show symptoms of hypoxia.
Right, that's the most sensitive organ.
And in this particular case, where you have a 90% stenosis of the right coronary artery, that's going to be limiting oxygen to the heart, right?
Yes,
And he has a big heart, right?
yes,
Needs more blood.
yes,
And adrenaline speeds up the heart.
yes.
Methamphetamine speeds up the heart.
It can, yes.
So methamphetamine and adrenaline cause the heart to work harder
Yes.
And
that can happen.
and increases the heart's oxygen needs.
Yes.
And at what point does the stenosis in the left and right coronary arteries become critical and cause the heart to stop? Generally.
Oh. Are you asking that same question about, as a forensic pathologist, what degree of narrowing do we consider potentially fatal?
Right.
70, 75% and above.
Now, in terms of drug use, right, you obviously were aware, based on the toxicology, that Mr. Floyd had certain drugs in his system, right?
Yes,
And so when we say on board, that means in the system.
yes.
Would you describe the use as you know, based on the information that you have, as sort of a binge use of drugs?
Oh, I guess I couldn't answer that.
Are you familiar with drug use taken or used rectally?
I've heard of that, yes.
And that increases or speeds up the distribution of controlled substances in a person?
It speeds up absorption, yes.
So the effects would be felt much faster.
Yes, they could. Mhm.
In a case where you have a person who is experiencing cardiac arrest, right? And they're put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital for resuscitation. There often, there's IVs that are placed in a person, right?
Yes,
And those IVs contain saline,
yes,
and saline can ultimately dilute or decrease, to some degree, the amount of controlled substances that would be as they would be measured.
that's a theoretical possibility.
You'd agree that fentanyl is a respiratory depressant, right?
Yes,
It slows breathing and lowers oxygen in the blood.
yes.
Does the fact that there's norfentanyl in his blood mean that he took it some time ago?
Yes, but by some time, that's a very vague, yeah.
So long enough in the past to start metabolizing.
Exactly, exactly.
But does it exclude him taking fentanyl more acutely or more recently in time?
No, there's no way really of knowing the timing.
Fentanyl depressing the respiratory system can also act with the coronary artery or can interact with coronary vessel disease, correct?
Can you clarify that? I'm
Sure.
sorry.
Does fentanyl's depression of the respiratory system also act with coronary artery vessel disease and oxygen and carbon dioxide to reduce the supply of its supply to the heart?
Oh, so as fentanyl may lead to a gradual progression of slowing breathing and ultimately decrease the oxygen, that would apply to oxygen to the brain as well as to the heart. Is that what you're, yeah.
And it would likewise increase the carbon dioxide in the blood.
Yeah, I mean, anything that decreases respiration decreases that exchange.
So as that exchange process is happening, right, you're not taking in the oxygen, you're likewise not expelling the carbon dioxide, right?
Right,
And thus the carbon dioxide will increase because you're not expelling it, right?
correct,
You would agree that methamphetamine is a stimulant, right?
correct.
And that can cause a cardiac arrhythmia,
It can,
and it can increase a person's heart rate.
it can or cannot.
And you testified before that methamphetamine, there's no safe level of methamphetamine, right?
Correct,
So the fact that methamphetamine is at a lower toxicological standard doesn't somehow make it safe.
right,
It doesn't exclude the possibility that it could increase the heart rate.
it could or not.
In terms of the evidence in this case, were you made aware that drugs were found in the backseat of the squad car?
Yes,
And that those drugs contained the DNA of Mr. Floyd?
yes,
And that those drugs were at least to some degree partially dissolved?
yes,
And that those drugs were fentanyl, a mixture of fentanyl and methamphetamine?
yes.
Based on the toxicology in this case, did you see any metabolic byproduct of methamphetamine?
No,
And so that means that the methamphetamine was taken more acutely or recently in time.
probably, I mean, there's lots of variables.
So again, just kind of taking into consideration removing certain variables, right? You find a person at home, no struggle with the police, right? And the person doesn't have a heart problem, but you find fentanyl and methamphetamine in this person's system at the levels that they are at. Would you certify this as an overdose?
Again, in the absence of any of these other realities, yes, I could consider that to be an overdose.
And the level of fentanyl in a person, again, in this hypothetical scenario, there are deaths certified as drug overdoses significantly lower than 11 nanograms per milliliter.
Lower, higher, it's got a huge range, yes,
As low, I believe, as 3% or 3 nanograms per milliliter.
yes,
Right. So the ingestion of drugs is unique to that individual's body, right?
right.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Ms. Blackwell.
Dr. Thomas, a few things I'd like to try to clarify with you.
Thank you.
You were asked a number of questions that were to the effect that if we take the police subdual, restraint, and neck compression out of this, what would you conclude Mr. Floyd's cause of death to be? Remember those questions?
Oh, yes,
Aren't those questions a lot like asking Mrs. Lincoln,
yeah,
if we take John Wilkes Booth out of this, may I finish? It's my
No,
analogy.
that's
Your Honor.
argumentative.
Dr. Thomas, if we put the police subdual, compression, and neck compression into this, restraint and neck compression into this, what was the cause, the manner of death for Mr. George Floyd?
The cause of death was the law enforcement subdual, restraint, and compression, and the manner of death is homicide.
Does it make any sense to you whatsoever from the standpoint of trying to assess cause and manner of death for Mr. Floyd to be answering questions having to do with hypothetically taking the facts of this case out relating to his subdual, restraint, and neck compression?
You can finish the question.
Dr. Thomas, from your standpoint as a forensic pathologist and your analysis of manner and cause of death, would you ever approach an assessment of manner and cause of death by taking out of it the facts that you found relevant and highly pertinent to assessing and determining the manner and cause of death?
No.
And in this case, those factors are what?
The law enforcement subdual, restraint, and compression.
And you were asked questions again about fentanyl and meth. Remember those questions?
Yes.
Do you know what quantity of meth was even involved or found in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream?
I have the number,
Well, let me ask you a
but
question.
it was very small. I mean, I do know that.
And so this was the point. You found that it was a very small amount.
Correct.
Were you able to assess, based on the amount, what kind of effect, if at all, it would have on the stress or strain on his heart?
No. There's too much individual variability to correlate one number with one person's reaction.
Well, let's see with respect to fentanyl, if there's a punchline we can get to with respect to fentanyl. Fentanyl has been discussed with you, Dr. Thomas, as a respiratory either depressant or suppressant.
Yes.
In order for us to go from fentanyl to death, in the middle, there are certain symptoms and responses and reactions a person would have who's suffering from fentanyl overdose or intoxication.
Yes.
If the person doesn't have those symptoms, those indicators, then would you feel that it's possible even to conclude that they are suffering from fentanyl intoxication or overdose?
No, if there's no signs of fentanyl overdose, then it makes no sense to conclude that there was an overdose from fentanyl.
And to be clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what are those symptoms of fentanyl overdose or intoxication?
So fentanyl is an opioid. It's like morphine or heroin, and it causes slowing. Well, first of all, it's a potent pain medication and given mostly for that, but it also can cause slowing of the respiratory rate in a very gradual, peaceful, non-struggle kind of way. What is described as people just fall asleep and may just kind of slump gradually over because they very peacefully stop breathing, or it slows and then eventually stops.
And they fall into a sleep out of which they can't even be aroused.
Correct.
Would that be also known as a coma?
Yes, ultimately it's a coma.
When George Floyd was on the ground for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, was he asleep to the point of not being able to be aroused?
Not for the first half of it, no. And then afterwards, he was completely unresponsive, but that's a different.
For the second half, he was unresponsive with no pulse.
Exactly.
Was George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, ever in a coma that you saw?
No.
So when we talk about fentanyl overdose, did you ever see, as applied to George Floyd, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds,
Okay.
did you ever see, as relates to fentanyl overdose, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that he was on the ground enduring the subdual and restraint by Mr. Chauvin, that he ever exhibited any of the symptoms of fentanyl intoxication?
No.
You asked, again, quite a few questions about the heart. And remember that discussion?
Yes.
I think it was to the effect the heart was slightly enlarged, high blood pressure, narrowing of the coronary arteries, dead heart muscle cells. Do you recall all of that being discussed?
Yes.
In order for us to go from there being issues with damage to the heart to a death from damage to the heart, in the middle, do we have to have certain cardiac events that then lead to death?
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if we're going to talk about heart conditions, what are those conditions in the middle that actually lead to death?
Well, what ultimately leads to death is an arrhythmia, an abnormal beating of the heart. And as I described, it's generally it's often called a sudden cardiac arrest because it's sudden and someone just drops over.
Now, to be clear, when we're talking about these various heart conditions and a sudden cardiac arrest, a fatal arrhythmia, did you see any indication of all this discussion about heart conditions that Mr. Floyd ever suffered from a sudden fatal cardiac arrhythmia as the primary cause of death?
No.
Was there any evidence that Mr. Floyd suffered from a heart attack?
No.
If you bring to mind what was found during the autopsy, was there any injury found to Mr. Floyd's heart whatsoever?
No.
So if we talk about, for example, dead heart muscle cells, any dead heart muscle cells seen on autopsy?
Not that Dr. Baker described and not that I saw, no.
In fact, his heart was so ordinary in terms of non-injury that it wasn't even photographed intact, was it?
Not intact, no. Dr. Baker took one photo that showed no scars and no acute injury.
Now, you were asked about certain studies out of Canada
Yes.
on the prone position.
Yes.
And now, and the findings out of Canada, supposedly with real police and real police settings, was no fatalities.
Yes.
Are you familiar with any such studies reaching that conclusion in the United States of America?
No.
What is so peculiar then about Canada that we're talking about Canadian studies here?
That's what I don't understand. I found that study and I just thought, I don't know how to interpret this because it's so contrary to the actual experience of forensic pathologists in the United States.
Now, you asked questions about whether the prone position is safe to lay on your stomach.
Yes.
Are you familiar with whether or not laying in the prone position automatically brings about a reduction in the oxygen reserves somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 24%?
I am not aware of that, but I would defer to a clinician.
Perhaps a pulmonologist?
That would be the best, yes.
I think you were, in fact, asked a question about laying by the pool on my stomach in Florida.
Yes.
George Floyd was not laying by the pool on his stomach in Florida, was he?
No.
I know the answer to this, but I'll ask you. You asked a question about sitting on a church bench with a baseball under your butt. You've never done that.
No.
Now, you were asked questions about symptoms of damage to the brain
Yes.
and whether there was any evidence of damage to Mr. Floyd's brain.
Yes.
Would you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury whether the fact that you observed an anoxic seizure in Mr. Floyd, was that evidence of damage to the brain?
So yes, what happens in the brain is when there's inadequate oxygen, it reacts by causing this anoxic reaction or seizure that we've described. If someone then goes on and essentially is brain dead, but their heart can be restarted and they're kept alive for, say, a day, and then they die, then you will see changes in the brain. But in a case like Mr. Floyd, where he died during this period of time and his heart was never able to be restarted, that is not enough time for the brain cells to show any kind of reaction that you could see at autopsy.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. No further questions.
Any further?
Dr. Thomas, after the heart stops, if a heart stops, is it possible that the body will continue to breathe or respire?
Yes, I suppose it could in some circumstances.
And that continued respiration after the heart stops could be a matter of a minute or two, correct?
I suppose that could happen.
And you would agree that methamphetamine also further constricts the arteries, right?
It can do that.
And so that constriction, there's been a lot of discussion about the level of methamphetamine in the system, this low level as it's been described, right? You said there's no safe level, agreed?
Yes.
Would you, as a physician, prescribe methamphetamine to a person who has a 90% or a 75% occlusion to his or her heart?
Objection, Your Honor, is beyond the scope and relevance.
You may answer it if you have an opinion in that regard.
Yeah, I don't have an opinion, I'm sorry.
Okay, no further questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. You're excused. Members of the jury will take our lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 1:30.